28 years later, a movie that actually had me questioning, holy hell, has it been 28 years since the first movie? And thankfully, no, I am not quite that old yet, but we are only 5 years off, and that is disgusting. Now, I know I usually say that my first horror movie was 13 Ghosts, but then I remember when I see 28 Days Later that I actually did see that at a middle school sleepover, or at least so much as I was willing to look at the screen because I was not a fan of horror at the time. Look how far I've come. The intro to E.T. used to scare me. But it is always interesting to remember, hey, yeah, that was my first experience with actual horror. I also have really vivid memories of people telling me about 28 Weeks Later when it came out, because I also didn't want to watch that, but wanted to know everything that happened. Oh my god, how the tables have turned. And now, after 18 years, we are getting another installment. And not just one, but 3 apparently? So they are really all in on this. And while that could be concerning for so many different reasons, I remain quite excited. For one, 28 Days Later is a fantastic take on the zombie-style movie because other than essentially becoming mindless killers, they are very different and so much more terrifying. So it was cool to see a different interpretation, even if a lot of that was heavily inspired by Resident Evil, but they've never been shy about pointing that out. Unlike other horror movies, it didn't get bogged down by countless sequels and spin-offs. It got one that wasn't anywhere near as well received, and they just stopped, so it doesn't have all that baggage. There are some graphic novels and supplemental stuff, but nothing that can really tarnish the movies. But the reason I'm most excited for this one is because Danny Boyle is back to direct and Alex Garland is writing. We love it when an original team comes back together. 28 Weeks Later was done entirely without them, and I attribute most of its issues to their absence. Oddly enough, I do think I like the base idea for 48 Weeks Later over what Garland had in mind, but Garland would have written a better movie. No offense to the 4 screenwriters it took to come up with that one. Because yeah, I'm just a huge fan of his approach to scripts and making movies with Ex Machina, Annihilation, and Civil War. Boyle's filmography is a little bit more eclectic, but still, I trust. And I really hope this one delivers because the second installment is already set for next year with Nia DaCosta directing, and she just got thrown under the bus by Marvel, and I'd hate to see that happen here. Not sure who's directing the third, but with the consistency of Garland writing all of them, I've got faith that it's gonna turn out well, and that they wouldn't be doing it unless they had 3 stories to tell. Because yeah, it's wild just to come back after 18 years with a whole new trilogy, but hell yeah, partner! So we're gonna start with my spoiler-free thoughts on the movie, then do a little rundown of the first 2 installments, and then dive in with the heavy spoilers. But yeah, this new movie also has an entire online interactive element like Bring Her Back did, but more like a whistleblower website that I'll detail in a bit. But the base premise of this new movie is that obviously it's been 28 years since the initial outbreak, and the infection was completely held off from the greater area of Europe, and England is now just a full quarantine zone with all the survivors left to fend for themselves. And the group we're following have essentially established a village on an island where only a heavily guarded causeway separates them from the mainland where the infected still roam. That means there are now kids being born who never even came close to experiencing civilization, which is what Spike here is. No knowledge of anything else the rest of the world has to offer. No phones, no internet, no anything really. But I'm guessing you're not stuck on a technology-free island and you are on the internet, which means your personal data is at risk of being stolen. And that's where today's sponsor, Incogni, comes in. Every time you put your personal data online, you run the risk of having it bought and sold by data brokers to people that can have some pretty bad intentions. Your email, phone number, address, and family member information are just bouncing around for people to exploit. The least concerning thing is that they'll just flood your email with spam, but unfortunately a lot of those scams that are really easy for us to pick out and see as fake might seem pretty believable to some of the older members of your family. Because in even worse case scenarios, your information could end up in the hands of somebody with more targeted intentions towards you and your loved ones. Add an AI to the mix and some of the most vulnerable people in your life are at risk of being taken advantage of. Especially in the US where people searching sites are popping up constantly that create detailed personal profiles for anyone to search. But Incogni will scan the web for the places that have your information and send requests on your behalf to have them removed. And because they pop up so rapidly, if you happen to notice your information on a website, you can send a custom request to Incogni to have it removed and they'll take care of that back and forth. A few times a year, I'll notice a flood of new scam calls, meaning my information's hit a new database. But anytime I go to check my Incogni report, they're already putting in the work on new data removal requests. I don't have to do a thing because they are just constantly searching on my behalf and handling all the objections. Because yeah, some of those guys want to put up a fight. And it can be that easy for you too. Just make an account, give Incogni the okay to work on your behalf, and they'll keep you updated as they handle those requests stress-free. So check out Incogni.com/Amanda and use code Amanda to get 60% off an annual plan and let Incogni take care of the headaches of data removal. So just some last spoiler-free thoughts. Overall, I think this installment is pretty good. It makes sense as a logical progression. It's interesting to see what life would look like if it essentially froze in time for 28 years, but then also had to start regressing without access to any modern technology and medicine. I think the performances are all really solid here. There's a lot of really good emotional resonance from the characters, a very solid performance from Alfie Williams as Spike, which is good because he really ends up being the focus of the movie. The tension in this is fantastic. They've really managed to flesh out the infected and how they they might progress after so many years to make them stay so scary. Some really cool shots where it parallels other moments in history with what's happening. It addresses a lot of what the outside world is doing in relation to England. I don't think I'm as stoked on this one as some people are, while still really enjoying it. Like, don't get me wrong, this is still a very good movie. I just think that there are some elements that don't come together as well as they could, but maybe those are problems that will end up solving themselves in future installments. Also, entirely too many zombie dongs. Honestly, we might as well be calling this 28 inches later. I'm sorry. I get that there's no logical way around that and they wouldn't have shame, but my god. By the end of the installment, you'll basically realize that so much of the movie is just focused on Spike realizing and accepting what death is, instead of someone who spent his life under the veil of death and a tragedy he wasn't around for. The way communities can insulate for self-protection, but also the fear of what happens when you're forced to adapt to unprecedented situations and what that means for the kids. But overall, definitely better than 28 Weeks Later, depending on what you're looking for with these types of movies. The atmosphere is really solid. It feels like there's genuine stakes. It gets quite terrifying at times, but this thing ends in the most absurd way possible, maybe even more absurd than some of the things that happen in 28 Weeks Later. And I think that's just more of the modern Alex Garland touch. It feels kind of in the realm of what he was doing with Annihilation and particularly Men. But that'll do it for the spoiler-free thoughts. I'll make it clear when I get to the spoilers, and I'll try to remember to put a timestamp down below. But first, let's take a little look at 28 Days Later. As mentioned, this was a beautiful partnership between Danny Boyle, who has movies that range from Trainspotting to Yesterday, and Alex Garland, who, other than Men, I always really enjoy, and even that one was at least interesting. Like, even if I walk away being like, I don't know how I feel about that, if your movie makes me want to do research, you've at least done something interesting. It released in 2002 in the UK and kicked off the resurgence of the zombie genre that had a strong run for at least a decade. And it's actually very good. They made the choice to film it with a series of mini DV cameras to get into tight spaces and cover multiple angles to navigate around people in the street, but was also a really great stylistic choice to match that gritty violence of the script. And I do really think it helps build that entire vibe to the world. The movie itself does a great job with the atmosphere. The way the infection works is terrifying by taking the one shortcoming zombies seem to have, the slow shuffling, and not just removing it, but sending it so far in the opposite direction that most of the infected that are doing like the craziest running are played by athletes. They also ramp up how quickly the infection takes over, so the combination of how rapid and rabid it is horrifying. I always forget how much I love the soundtrack until I hear the central theme by John Murphy, who would go on to reuse that in Kick-Ass, and it just drops you into the story in the best way, with Cillian Murphy's character Jim waking up in an abandoned hospital to wander out to an even more abandoned London. Garland actually took the inspiration for the intro and other aspects of the story from Day of the Triffids, and while Robert Kirkman has never confirmed that he was inspired by either that or 28 Days Later, the opening to the Walking Dead comics, which started being published the year after 28 Days Later came out in the UK, but it was the same year it came out in the US, is also very similar. I will say there is a certain horror to having Rick thrown right into it in the hospital with the kitchen, but there's this crazy dystopian horror element in 28 Days Later where Jim has literally no idea what's going on and what possibly could have happened to cause a bear in London, and like the more he finds things on the street, the more he sees missing posters, it almost makes it all more confusing. And all those London shots are real. It was a lot of very precise timing just before rush hour, but regardless of inspiration, that's a great way to introduce this situation. Have the thing be in full effect and then drop the central character into it so we learn along with them in horror. So this movie does actually give us the best of both worlds. The intro to the movie is how the outbreak itself started, with a group of activists trying to release chimps that have been infected with a rage virus and then just fed a bunch of super violent videos. Even with the warning of infection, they release one of the chimps, and that's all it takes because the virus spreads fast. Like in seconds, people are completely gone and spreading it to others. Completely overtaken by extreme and uncontrollable rage forever. So the established rules for the infection are pretty similar to what you'd expect. You get bit, you turn, but also if you ingest any of their blood, get it in a cut or your eye, also infected. Another installment in the list of movies of why isn't everyone wearing more protective gear? But the thing that makes it even more dangerous is they are just constantly puking up their bloody guts. So like you're trying to fight it off you when you're doing a good job, but then suddenly it's like puking into your eyes. All starting with the intention of finding a way to control feelings of rage in humanity, but ending with the exact opposite outcome. And it makes for a really interesting parallel, as so many zombie type movies do, for who and what the real monsters are. Whose lack of humanity is gonna cause the most damage. But after that intro, we get to 28 Days Later with Jim, who gets brought up to speed pretty fast after being attacked inside a church when two survivors, Mark and Selena, save him, but he still insists on going to his parents' home to make sure they're really dead and to see how bad things got. And I love this moment. Obviously, it's super sad they've chosen to go out in their sleep, leaving behind a picture of him in hopes that he wouldn't wake up, but leaving a final message if he did, meaning that they had to leave him in that hospital alone in the coma. So brutal. And sadly, Jim gets a pretty quick indication of how fast and quietly these things can move in rage just from catching a glimpse of his candle, and how quickly Selena will lay him out if he ends up infected.
Wait.
The two then come across a father, Frank, played by Brendan Gleeson, and his daughter Hannah, and the four traveling together starts to build a bit of hope as they try to find this military outpost that's been broadcast. Selena starts to realize that you can hope for more than just survival in this dystopia, and that's what will really make surviving matter all the more. They manage pretty well not to run into too much trouble during the day. This movie really suggests that the infected hate daylight, but in 28 weeks later, they are all up in that daylight, so maybe it's just that they're less active in the day. Jim does end up having to kill an infected kid who I'm pretty sure is the one from the missing poster in the beginning of the movie because of how much they zoom in on it. But the big focus of this movie ends up being when they get to that blockade. At first, there's no one there, and Frank really starts losing it because he's so desperate to provide some kind of future for Hannah, and it seems like there's nothing here. In frustration, he ends up kicking a gate to make a crow fly away, which is when a drop of infected blood gets in his eye. And that's just so sad. Like, I remember when I watched this again after seeing it in middle school, there were only certain things I remembered, and that scene was one. Because it's just so sad. He's desperately trying to get Hannah away from him, apologizing for losing his temper before those soldiers finally reveal themselves to kill him. So shitty, but the exact person they needed to kill so that it would have the biggest emotional impact on the audience. But then I remember where the movie goes. It's the way they stress that they found 2 females and a male, and the way they talk about their plans to rebuild. Uh-oh. I know it's only been about a month at this point, but I guess that's all the horror and solitude these soldiers can handle without a clear hope for a future. I don't think I need to spell it out, but they are specifically trying to lure women in, and probably why they'd be okay with Frank having to be killed, and I'm kind of surprised they didn't just kill Jim in that moment too, probably just to keep everybody docile, which in my opinion makes them significantly worse monsters than what might be outside their walls, especially with Hannah being underage. Major West just seeing it all as part of his duty to keep his men alive. There's also just a lack of humanity in a lot of other areas. One of the men gets infected and they chain him up, mostly to see how long it'll take them to die off if left alone, but this was supposed to be their friend. While Selena came around to the idea of life being more than survival as long as there's some kind of companionship, these soldiers get caught up in that idea of there being no point to anything without civilization as an establishment. That even if some of the people you care about die, the larger thing won't collapse. But their way of trying to achieve that is actually going against their humanity and what's required for a healthy civilization and order. Not realizing that those larger establishments are useless without the people, they're just ideas. Literally only one soldier tries to stop what they're trying to do to Hannah and Selena, and he gets shot for it, but Jim narrowly escapes. Also gotta point out that he catches a glimpse of a plane through the trees here, implying that things probably haven't completely collapsed, which is when we get to see that anyone can act like the infected if they're desperate enough, if they're pushed enough. And Jim goes on an all-out rampage to save Selena and Hannah. Releases their trapped infected guy, gouges out someone's eyes. So intense that Selena almost kills him thinking he is infected. Really bringing it back to that statement from Major West of it's always been people killing people. Will you reject that? Will you come back from it? Or will you play into it? From here, the three manage to escape after taking out Major West, narrowly saving Jim once again, and it cuts to 28 days later with them in the countryside, plane flying overhead, maybe to get rescued. I know there are some alternate endings where Jim dies, but yeah, that is the end. I think that might be the weakest point of the movie, but I don't immediately know how I'd want it to end, so sick. Just a really solid horror movie that actually gets more terrifying when you're away from the infected, because damn, that shit would be my nightmare. I would end myself. Bringing us to 48 weeks later, which I actually had not seen, and yeah, it is nowhere near as good. There are some really solid ideas. Like I said, I think I might prefer what they had in mind to what Garland was originally planning, but it completely goes off the rails and doesn't actually seem to be doing much of anything. Which it doesn't need to, it's just a massive step down. But I will say this one has a stacked cast. We got Rose Byrne, Idris Elba, Robert Carlyle, Imogen Poots, and Jeremy Renner. But this one essentially takes us back to what was happening in the weeks following the outbreak. After 5 weeks, the infected started to die off. After 11 weeks, the Americans enter London to assess the situation. 18 weeks later, mainland Britain is declared safe from infection. At 24 weeks, they start reconstruction, and now at 28 weeks, they're bringing more people back over to restart. They also make it pretty clear that the infection didn't manage to spread past England because of the ocean, so that's nice at least. I'm just imagining a bunch of infected on that train that goes underwater to Paris. I know in the first movie they say that there was reports of the infection hitting New York, but I guess Buddy from the first movie was right that England was actually just a quarantine zone. But before all that, we get a little group of survivors being overrun by infected, and Don here abandons his wife 2 times technically before escaping off as the sole survivor. And I get it, it's scary, but come on, man. And now I guess he works at the facility where they're doing the new district, so he gets to bring his kids over who were thankfully abroad during this whole thing. Something that Rose Byrne's character Scarlett is not okay with. She doesn't think things are secure enough to have kids here yet, but I guess Don pulled enough strings to make it happen. I laughed so hard when I realized that shit stain was their dad while he has to lie to them about what happened to their mother. This is kind of gonna be a big theme here, consequences of actions and family. But yeah, this is all technically under NATO control, but mostly the US military.
The US Army is responsible for your safety.
Oh goody, I bet they feel so safe. Now, the one thing they've made sure to drive home is that the son, Andy, has heterochromia just like his mom. So you know that's going to be a major factor. It's on the poster too. But the kids aren't super bright. He really just wants a picture of their mom so he doesn't forget her. So Tammy takes him outside of the quarantine zone to go back to their old house immediately after they explained why it was so dangerous. And I just have no idea how they could manage to do this. Jeremy Renner does clock it, but no one can get there before they actually make it out and super far away. In a kind way, I'd like to say, oh look, it is actually showing that they don't have control over the situation. They have no understanding of what's happening, but it is probably just bad writing. But when they get to their old house, Andy finds their mom hiding in the room upstairs, acting really weird but still alive, still seemingly horrified and traumatized, squeezing Andy so tight before the military descends. Massive trauma reaction.
We found your kids. Oh, thank God. We found your wife, too.
I bet his stomach dropped out of his ass. His kids are gonna be so pissed that he lied. Gotta take a second to draw attention to the NoFX poster on Tammy's wall. Great album, very funny that they're essentially under US military control right now. But pretty quickly they realize that something isn't quite right with Alice outside of the trauma. She has bite marks, one eye seems to semi-look like it's infected, and the blood shows that she's absolutely infected, but she's not displaying any symptoms. But even though she's not symptomatic, she's still a carrier, so when Donnie Boy goes in here to try to make amends for abandoning his wife with the smooch, instantly infected and then brutally kills her. Real winner of a husband here, he's a disaster. I get that this wasn't really his fault, but like in the long way of things, it kinda is. And the entire facility descends into chaos as they try to follow isolation protocols. You'd think they'd learn about piling up a bunch of panicked people together when there's an outbreak starting, but I guess the US military wasn't around for round one. At this point, Scarlett realizes that the kids might also have that immunity inside them and makes it her mission to get them to safety, so hopefully they can come up with a cure or some kind of preventative measure. And the only reason why they make it out after Idris calls the total destruction of any moving being is because old Jeremy Renner just couldn't shoot Andy. I'm sure there's a statement here about American intervention making things significantly worse, but at the end of the day, this all falls on Dawn. I'm being harsh, but still. Anyways, the movie at this point is really just focused on getting those kids to safety. Renner's buddy Flynn has an extraction point for him, so they're just all trying to get there, but once Flynn reaches them, he doesn't realize that there's kids there, doesn't want to take them, and then the movie completely goes off the rails. He uses the helicopter to chop up the infected at ground level. What is happening? And doesn't crash out. Helicopters are ridiculously sensitive. Those things are blowing up all the time. And I can't tell if that made this movie better or worse or some sick combination of both. So much of this is more absurd than the first, but this scene is a special level of absurd, especially for the general tone of the movie. So after that mess, they have to get to a new extraction point where on the way, Jeremy Renner gets burned alive. It's just so silly. Like, you know, this scene required so much setup. Like, I'm sorry, it's supposed to be emotional. It's a little bit emotional, but my God. They then up the tension with some subway night vision where somehow their infected dad also is. Just somehow got into the London Tube. Please don't hurt me. And just starts bashing Scarlett to death. Guys, I think this movie might hate women a little bit. He then bites Andy, only stopping when Tammy screams his name, calling back to his wife, desperately trying to get him to help her. I don't know if he was actually consciously aware of that happening. I think they're at least suggesting that is, but then he goes to attack Tammy. She shoots him, and Andy does in fact seem to be immune to the virus like his mom. Happy ending! Orphans! Thankfully, they make it to that new extraction point and Flynn agrees to fly them out of there, leaving us with the knowledge that somehow the infected spread over to Paris, meaning all of mainland Europe is fucked. I don't know if the kid accidentally turned Flynn and that made it spread out because Scarlett didn't actually really explain what was going on with them, but apparently Boyle and Garland are completely ignoring the fact that it broke out of England. We'll see what they do. I'm recording this before I watch the movie. But that brings us to 28 years later, which has thankfully only actually been 23 years, but that means we're in the spoilers. Before we pick up with the main plot, it does the thing it typically does and starts us off with a separate group of people, and it is that horrifying scene from the teaser where it's just a bunch of terrified kids watching the Teletubbies. I was so immediately taken by that teaser. I honestly kind of wish that more of the movie had that tone before the infected start overrunning the house, and one kid, Jimmy, survives. Reaches his father in the church, who doesn't escape with him, but simply says that this is Judgment Day and these people aren't dying, they're all being saved.
For this is a glorious day. Day of judgment.
Wackadoodle! I will say I love the commitment to actually having the kids get massacred without fully showing it, but kind of showing it. Like, they didn't really shy away here. But Jimmy manages to escape, runs off, and then we cut to 28 years later with the explanation that England's been abandoned by the rest of the world, and if you set foot on it, you're gonna be stuck there for life. But this village we pick up with is pretty well thriving. Everyone has different responsibilities, they have a school, food, and they're connected to mainland England through a causeway that can only be accessed during low tides and heavily monitored at all hours of the day. day. So that's definitely going to be a problem at some point, but not now. But there does seem to be a hint of weirdness on the island. There's these masks all over the place with no real explanation. Doesn't seem like a cult at this point, but who knows what's going to be up their sleeves to maintain order. But our focus is on Spike, the son of Aaron Taylor Johnson's character Jamie, and his mom Jodie Comer is Isla, who is very unwell. At first I thought it was some severe mental illness, which obviously they wouldn't have medicine for long term, but over time it does seem like it's more of a brain tumor or something in that realm. She's having nosebleeds, has all these different spells, is in pain a lot. But this day that we're dropped in is the day that Jamie's taking Spike to the mainland to learn how to hunt. But not food, infected, to learn how to protect the village and scavenge for essentials. Either way, everyone is really cheering on his first time. This is some rite of passage, and while dangerous, it's this thing that's supposed to be more exciting than a doomed mission. And it's here that they start swirling in these different montages of different child armies being trained, infected, under red vision, ripping things apart. All very unsettling until they come across what they call a slow and low infected, bloated bodies dragging themselves across the ground eating worms. Somehow that's the grossest thing about all this. No real explanation as to why, just the assumption that infection does different things to different people long term. Though I think that's one of the things Alex Garland said he got inspired by Last of Us for. But before long, things get even more unsettling. They find someone strung upside down, letters etched into his body, left for the infection, and probably not that long ago, with no real indication of who or why they might have done this. But before much thought can be put into that, they come across evidence of the fast infected before Spike sees the head of an elk that was clearly ripped off its body, so the spine came with it, and that terrifies Jamie. He's instantly trying to rush them back to the coast to get back home when a lone infected stares at them from across the field as more and more start to appear until one bigger one shows up. And that's when we learn that they've developed alphas within their infected that have a higher level of intelligence and have a swarm of other infected around them that are pretty much at their control. Absolutely terrifying. They make a break for a house, narrowly making it into the attic while taking some out, but the alpha is just standing there for hours, unmoving, staring at them. I would be so incredibly terrified the entire time. Holy shit. There's literally just something so terrifying about like a silhouette of something staring off at you from the distance. But they don't seem too concerned right now while they're in the house, and they kind of take notice of a boat in the distance, which is apparently some other country doing patrols to make sure no one's trying to get off the island, which apparently a variety of different countries do. And I'd been thinking for ages that it would have been really interesting if they did a thing like in Jurassic Park where people were selling private tours to like kill infected and hunt them down. I really thought that was an angle this might take. But also, that's when Spike notices a fire off in the distance, a pretty big one, and his father seems very off-put by what it might be and doesn't want Spike asking any questions about it, and they just go to sleep. Then somehow that herd of elk runs by again and shakes the house so much that it starts to collapse, so they start running. They make a run for the coast thinking they've made it. You know, there's still some water up there, but it's shallow enough that they can go. But they start celebrating just a little bit too soon because suddenly that alpha is tearing after them with some great pulled back shots where you can just see the water spray behind it as they're running. Absolutely terrifying. All precursored by an army of crows. And it's just the way that humans hunt. That's so often why zombies kind of like itch that part of your brain. It's kind of the way we hunt. It's that slow, methodical, never giving up. So your prey is run off and then suddenly it's waking up in the middle of the night with you over it with an axe. But now they've taken that and sped it up to terrifying levels. Every single one of these things is Usain Bolt. Thankfully, they narrowly managed to make it back and take it out just in time because the alphas do take a lot more than just a couple arrows to put down, and they head off for Spike's celebration, which he is really not feeling. He's very overwhelmed, which I get. That was a very terrifying ordeal, and now he is just surrounded by bodies. But when he goes to leave, he hears his dad who snuck off with another woman, and he is pretty disgusted that it seems like he's essentially giving up on his mother. The movie honestly does a really good job showing like this young boy who's like loved his father really kind of like losing respect for him, because again, he really doesn't have any frame of reference for different illnesses and which ones are and aren't possible to treat. So to him, he just can't understand why his dad's not trying to help more. So that's when he becomes an idiot. The night before, he ends up telling this man watching his mom about seeing the fires, and that guy instantly knows it's someone named Kelson, apparently a doctor from the old world. So after a tense moment the next day where Spike pretty well confirms that his dad isn't worried about figuring out what's wrong with his mom, he sneaks off with her to the mainland to track down Dr. Kelson. All by his lonesome, with a mother who's frequently bopping in and out of times and sometimes calls him her dad. And we do get a little bit more information on Kelson through Jamie, who says that years ago he ran into him with some friends and he's just constantly accidentally burning this massive fire and had rows and rows of bodies perfectly lined up and was just like casually trying to call them over. So he's pretty sure that the dude is insane and dangerous, but there are lots of different ways this could turn out. But they start making their way there. He has to kill the zombie that everyone thought was Cillian Murphy, who is not in this one. At night, she ends up bashing one of the slow and lows to death, but then doesn't even remember it by the next morning. I'll also note that the crows really seem to congregate around the infected, particularly the alphas, but it's usually at night and very creepy. But then it cuts to a group of military guys running, shooting things, ultimately taken out by an alpha with one person surviving to make it out. One of these guys also has his spine ripped out through his head, so that is a brutal little trend kill this guy's got going on. Probably from the boat they saw last night, who's now stuck on the island and helps save Spike and Isla from both being eaten and dying in a gas buildup. And he is a really interesting character to introduce because he keeps talking about all these things from back home and Spike doesn't know what any of it is. Like internet, zero idea. Doesn't even have a concept of what that could possibly be. Never heard of a cell phone, definitely never conceived of something like a smartphone, which I think is actually pretty funny because this whole movie was filmed with crazy iPhone rigs, which felt like a really nice continuation of using the old DV cameras for the first movie, and also lets them do some pretty crazy shots, like this 180 degrees of vision, allowing those donks to flap in full range. But it's super funny because Eric shows him a picture of his fiance who's clearly had some filler done, and Spike just looks at it so weird and is like, what's wrong with her face? And then goes on to compare it to someone from their village with a shellfish allergy. I just thought that was a fantastic little touch. Now, before this, one of the flashes we got to different creepy things happening was clearly of a pregnant infected. So Edward Collins, step aside, we got a new freaky deaky baby on the way. And that's who they come across next. In this train, this infected is giving birth, who seems to have a moment of enough clarity or like calm to let Isla help her. And the baby actually comes out clean, not infected at all, but then mommy snaps out of it. Eric snaps and shoots her, starts to insist they put the baby down because obviously he's like, that's basically a ticking time bomb. But he keeps backing up and away from them until he gets to like an open section of the train and boom, he's snatched up by an alpha, and again, head and spine detached from body like he's excited to have unlocked some new Mortal Kombat fatality. So I'm guessing that this was Daddy Dearest, and now he's fucking pissed that his lady's dead and they have his baby and starts chasing him. Which is when we finally run into Kelson, who's figured out how to sedate them with a trank, but for some reason he doesn't just finish him off. He calls this one Samson. The answer, I'm sure, is that they need him around for the sequel when he's probably going to try to hunt down his child, but I also think that Kelson has a different appreciation for them as humans that are just sick. And takes them back to his bone graveyard, talking about memento mori, which is always being prepared to die, and basically stating that he's dedicated himself to creating this kind of shrine of skull and bones as a memorial for these people. Or specifically, remember you must die, which sounds ominous, but it's also really just supposed to speak to the beauty in life while it's around. They contrast it with remember you must love. I think a big part of this movie can be used to look at how we as society can ignore horrors in exchange for self-preservation. You can see it so clearly with this quarantine zone that's been entirely abandoned that the whole world would leave them to collapse, where the best case scenario is being seen as some kind of horrific science experiment. We will ignore death if it's easier. We will regress if it's easier. The main conflict of this movie is really just centered around a boy who can't accept death in an environment you'd expect to be soaked in it, but it's progressed to be insulated from it all, and denying the reality of death cheapens life. Because I think you also need to acknowledge that this society has insulated itself from the horrors of the rest of the world. You might be questioning that because they do bring Spike to the mainland to show him things, but that really is more of a rite of passage than any kind of necessity. Memento Mori is actually the passcode to get into the website I mentioned earlier that I will get to later. Fun stuff. So he is in fact a doctor and assumes the reason why the baby isn't infected is because the placenta would have insulated her from it, which is very interesting. Would they then just eat the baby in other situations, or would the baby become an infected after ingesting infected milk? Who knows? Maybe they do. Maybe we'll find out. But as expected, tragically, the mom is dying. She has cancer that's progressed pretty far into her lymph nodes and brain. And again, because Spike just has no concept of illness and how hopeless it is under the best case circumstances, when it's this far along, he is just begging for everything, for anything to be done. So they have to sedate him a little bit so he won't care when Kelson does the kindness of mercy killing the mom because she knows that she doesn't have that much longer to make it, saying that there's a lot of ways to die, but with love is the best way, not ravaged in pain by disease or infected. Spike has to learn in this moment that while tragic, death is the price to knowing the value of life, that in love, people live on. And then the next day, he places his mom's skull at the top of the temple, facing the sunrise, getting me in my feels. Yes, that did actually almost get to me. But then they end up attacked by Samson, again, seemingly looking for the baby and revenge, so Kelson sends him and the baby on their way after they manage to knock him out again. Still not sure why they didn't just kill him the day before when he was knocked out like that. Maybe it's because if they started trying to kill him, he would snap out of it. I don't know. Somehow Spike makes it back with like no inconvenience, but just leaves the baby behind with a letter that says that he's just going to continue traveling the mainland until he makes it somewhere as he can't see the coast. No idea why his dad wasn't already across the island trying to find him, but now he's trying to run at him, but the tide's too high. He's over there. And they do show that Spike's doing a pretty good job now, and he's really not as scared anymore. He's just laying out infected, but then he comes across a blockade with a very theatrical man atop it, with a group of very theatrical people, and this is Jimmy. You can tell by his little inverted cross now that he took from his dad or got from his dad, the kid that ran away at the beginning of the movie, if I'm not clear. I also collected the side of one of the houses, had a saying with Jimmy painted in huge letters next to it, so they are potentially the ones who strung up that guy. But this is like a comical group of circus ninjas. Literally feels like we flipped into a live action anime. They all have long blonde hair, elaborate outfits, varied weapons, and nunchucks sawing off heads. It's just as much of a performance as it is just like killing infected. It feels like it was shot like an episode of the Power Rangers with like the camera showing them flip from below. Oh my god, wait, he actually has a Power Rangers toy in his room that he almost takes with him on that first mission. So that was absolutely intentional that they shot it that way. The get-ups and hair are inspired by Jimmy Savile, a notorious British media personality who turned out to be one of the most notorious child sex offenders. Those crimes wouldn't have been discovered by the wider public until well after the initial outbreak happened, and that was actually intentional from Boyle and Garland. That people trying to establish the new world might start snagging major aspects of a culture long dead, carrying over any elements they can grasp. They said it was supposed to speak to the ways that the past can be misremembered or distorted with time, so in this world we get the divergence of this group turning him into a godlike figure without knowing the truth about his life that we do as an audience. And they apparently just exist to reintroduce evil to the compassionate environment Spike's always had. Absolutely wild, so this is gonna be who Spike gets stuck with for the next little bit, so I don't know what's going on in his village, if it might be something minorly cult, but I can't even begin to understand what's going on with these freaks. Oh, and Jimmy is played by Jack O'Connell, who just got off his excellent run as Remick in Sinners, so a great handful of films for him playing this quirky villain, or I just assume that he's some kind of villain, or at least like in-between weirdo cult leader. Okay, so getting to the online element, it's a bunch of different data reports, messages, stolen pictures, and correspondence, basically people from the mainland trying to put together what's actually happening in the quarantine zone and what the governments are still doing. Intercepted audio transmissions and a transcription from the Swedish soldiers being shipwrecked, begging for help. Then there's leaked correspondences between scientists about how the infection is changing, mentioning the slow and lows, not knowing what's happened specifically to them to cause the tissue to engorge. Then the more horrifying reports of potential alphas, but not having any idea how they could gain or sustain that kind of mass, making it seem like they know the infection develops in a certain way that specifically requires the cells to have enough to maintain a level of rage. But this also means that while this is supposed to be a quarantine zone, there is still research happening, and one scientist really wants more samples and increased security clearance, so I'm guessing that'll be a point in one of the future installments, or just the idea that this will never stay fully contained. Audio files of bells ringing from the quarantine zone, making people wonder if they've established churches or if it's just a warning system. There's even reports about Spike's community known as the Lindisfarne Commune, set on Holy Island, and we see in the movie that it seems like they've set up a religion here, which I assume the mask will end up tying into. Main point from the correspondence is that they don't pose any threat or plan to break quarantine. Then you get images of a girlfriend posting about her boyfriend on Instagram being missing, presumably another of the soldiers that's now dead. Then someone commenting about all the money they spent monitoring England and that it's useless because there's really just no activity happening there anymore. I think it's interesting that whoever put this leak site together in-universe was also keeping an eye out on social media of people who could be involved in patrols. They have infrared pictures of the packs, then aerial pictures of the Bone Temple, which would have to be horrifying with no frame of reference. Love that the movie makes it a beautiful thing. And the last piece is a message of someone talking about the virus, everything that's been left in the last 28 years of guilt, confusion, not knowing why it's all still a secret, that all the images are classified, that they ban connection with the survivors and conceal the fact that the infected may be adapting. All great points, but I guess I do maybe understand discouraging communication. Some schmuck falls in love with an island survivor and gets blown up by the military trying to get there. But realistically, there's no reason why you couldn't be like dropping in supplies. But yeah, that's pretty much the site if you want to check it out yourself. The password is Memento Mori. I'll have it linked down below. And I just love that more movies are doing stuff like this. But that is pretty well 28 days later. Some of that flair is absolutely absurd in the context of everything happening, but I guess it makes sense that you'd end up with a pretty varied level of survivors. But yeah, I could not have anticipated that final sequence seeming like it came out of Power Rangers. But yeah, very wide range of emotions and tones in this one. Most of them all work together pretty well with some occasional just awkward moments or awkward dialogue delivery. I still think the infected hunting tourism would be an interesting thing to explore in these movies, but this is fine. But I'm definitely still excited to see what they have coming next. They're really big on trying to do something that's different within this genre of movies, but they are taking some inspiration from The Last of Us, which they've said. I think Garland openly said that Last of Us is a better story, and yeah, no offense, The Last of Us story really does blow this out of the water, but this is still super interesting, and I am very excited to see what happens next. Garland said that part 1 was supposed to be about family, and that the next section is going to be about the nature of evil, so can't wait. We really could just be getting a cult v cult thing here. So let me know what you guys thought of this one down below. Did you love it? Did you hate it? Did you fall in the middle? Let me know. But thank you all so much for watching. Thanks as always to my Patreon supporters and YouTube channel members, and to Incogni for sponsoring the video. Subscribe to the channel if you're new, leave a like on the video if you're into that kind of thing. All my other social medias are listed down below. I hope you're all having a fantastic day. I'm mostly okay, and we'll catch you all later.